So thank you. And I feel like the previous speaker and myself go very much hand in hand because brain injury it is a trauma in and of itself, but it's a specific type of trauma. So it's one that's often missed and not recognized as much. And so particularly talking about the hidden impact of brain injury, because brain injury is something that I deal with on a daily basis through my job and as part of the Brain Injury Network. But prior to that, when I was working as a practitioner out in the world, I didn't realize that brain injury had as much of an impact as it did on our services. And then when I got involved in brain injury, I all of a sudden realized that it was everywhere. So once you start looking for it, it really is everywhere. One of the things, particularly that reason standing here today, is about a year ago, I had said this statement to Pam Sagnis, that traumatic brain injury is the leading cause of death and disability in children and teens. And that statement sort of blew her away. She was like, what do you mean it's the leading cause? I said, well, it's the leading cause of death and disability. Pretty much, it's the leading cause of death and disability until other things start hitting us, like heart disease. So it kind of remains that leading cause. But it's never talked about. It's not something that we know much about. So as people recognize and go, hey, wait a minute, it really is this cause, we really should be paying more attention to it. And that's why should we be worrying about brain injury? Well, there's a huge annual incidence. Across the country, we have had quite the uptick in hospitalizations for brain injury and reporting of brain injury. That's been related over the last 10 years to new concussion guidelines. So now there's been this idea that people have to seek medical care. So now we've had all of these individuals. But really, it's part of that awareness. People are being more aware of brain injury and that it is having an impact on people. And the annual economic impact of brain injury has quite an impact on our society and our systems. So, but more than that, it really is the long-term impacts, and that's what I want to talk about today. Brain injury has a severity continuum. When we're talking about brain injury, a severe brain injury is what we typically think of when we think of brain injury. Severe brain injury is somebody that's been in a coma for longer than 24 hours. But mild to moderate brain injuries are brain injuries as well, and those are ones that are often forgotten about. But we don't think about brain injury. We don't talk about it. It's a silent epidemic. It very much is called that, the silent epidemic. And that's because there really is a lack of awareness. Childhood injuries are often forgotten. There are no outward signs, unreported, non-accidental injuries, minor blows. These are all things that make it silent, that it's out there, but we're not really paying attention to it. Often individuals have a brain injury and they have no outward signs. Another thing that makes it a really silent epidemic is that brains are like snowflakes. We all have unique brains at the start, and then each brain injury is unique. So how an individual is injured is unique. So somebody that has a fall at 4 has a very different injury than a shaken baby. So it's not a typical brain injury. So that also makes it really hard to have a concept of what a brain injury is, because they're all unique and different. There are a few things that are unique to pediatric brain injury, unique with children. One of the things is children are more likely to survive. They're more likely to survive a brain injury, and they are less likely to lose consciousness. Children are really resilient physically. They bounce back great. We all would like to go back to the physical resiliency as we had as children. But that often means that they are more vulnerable to these things because they are so resilient physically. So we do not recognize the impact of the injury at the time of the injury because they bounce back so well. Less than 2% of children with brain injury are referred for special education. This has to do with the fact that often, in order to access special education services, children have to meet specific criteria through the federal regulations, but also has to do with the fact that the injury may not be impacting their education, but it still is impacting them in their personal lives. And then there's this huge myth within brain injury. I actually recently even saw this myth in a newspaper article here in North Dakota. The idea that younger is better when it comes to a brain injury. You are better off for a child to have a brain injury when they are younger than it is for an adult. I'll often hear people say, well, at least they were young, so they'll be able to bounce back. But that, we know in the brain injury world, is a myth. And here's why this is a myth. There's this idea of time reveals rather than heals, and that you're growing into an injury. So what will happen is a child will have their injury, and at the time of the injury, it might be impacting them. But then they bounce back and they're doing great. They're back in school, things are going wonderful. But then as that injury catches up with them, they reach developmental milestones and they stall. And it's what's called this neurocognitive stall. Because if a child has an injury at 4, you cannot assess their rational decision-making skills because they're not utilizing those yet. They have not reached that stage of development. But then, once they reach that stage of development, they're having difficulties with their reasonable development skills. They don't have those. They've been damaged. But we weren't able to assess that. So what happens is that's this child growing into that injury. So often what I will see is children that had an injury and had a period of fine development, and then all of a sudden start to have problems. And people don't equate it back to the brain injury. Instead, it's seen as something new. Well, but they didn't have this after the injury. This must be new. But really, it is that injury. It just now is showing itself. There are also challenges with assessments when it comes to brain injury. Brain injury is often not screened. This is something that I sort of have looked at, and over time, brain injury isn't screened for. It's not asked about a past history of brain injury. Individuals with brain injury may often appear and test normal. It is actually very rare for a brain injury to impact an individual's IQ. Usually their actual IQ will remain the same. It's more their functional application skills that they have problems with. So individuals often will test okay, but then have problems in other areas. And it's a moving target. Because of that concept of growing into the injury and their actual recovery, it's hard to see where the student is at. One day they might have problems in this area, and then another day have problems in another area. And part of that is the nature of brain injury. It is moving, and working with that recovery is moving. And it's often misdiagnosed. Often brain injury is the more overarching issue, but the individual components and symptoms of that are what is being diagnosed and what the individual is accessing treatment for. So, but in talking about all of this, and the reason why brain injury obviously is a big passion of mine and why I feel that it is so important to bring it, is because it's important to be providing accurate identification. One of the things that we really miss is accurately identifying the brain injury and letting people know that it can be having an impact on their functionality. This is important for individuals to receive appropriate interventions, to have that awareness of that potential cognitive stall coming about, development of self-advocacy skills, and to prevent future difficulties. Because one of the things that we do know now from research is that unfortunately there are long-term impacts from pediatric brain injury. Individuals with brain injury are overrepresented in lots of populations, behavioral health services. They're overrepresented, criminal justice populations, among the homeless. The primary cause within these research is pediatric brain injury. So I'll start with kind of criminal justice. Criminal justice studies have been shocking regarding brain injury. Across the board, many studies, even done in the US, New Zealand, and Australia, have looked at a history of brain injury as high as 60 to 80% among incarcerated individuals. Minnesota actually did a study, and Minnesota looked at the individuals incarcerated, and they found that 82% of their males had a history of brain injury. Most of those occurred prior to their involvement with the criminal justice system and prior to their reaching adulthood. Females, their female population was 90% of the female prisoners had a history of brain injury. Again, majority of them, it was prior to their involvement with the criminal justice system and pediatric injury. And then their juveniles. This was the most telling. 99% of the juveniles in Minnesota that reached incarceration had a history of brain injury. That actually, when they were doing this study, it was actually only 49 individual kids that reached that stage. But out of those 49 kids, they recalled over 260 incidences of brain injury. So even if you consider they lied, that worked out to on average, 4 injuries per kid. So they really found that the impact on these kids and how it affected their thinking and their cognitive processing. One of the things that Minnesota found as part of their follow-up studies was that their prisoners with a history of brain injury cost more money as prisoners. They were more expensive prisoners than their prisoners that did not have a history of brain injury. So Minnesota actually did a follow-up work where they actually did intensive education with those prisoners with brain injury and provided intensive outpatient, when they were released, outpatient services to help them be accessing in the community to help lower that recidivism rate amongst those individuals. Substance abuse. The leading researcher on brain injury and substance abuse said that the connection between substance abuse and a previous brain injury is so great that he feels that warning individuals with brain injury about the potential for substance abuse is like not warning Little Red Riding Hood about the wolf. Because he said that over half of the individuals accessing substance abuse services have a history of TBI. I can tell you for about a year now, I've been doing screening at Southeast Human Service Center, and it's higher than that on the screenings I'm doing. So it is significant, that past history of brain injury amongst our substance abuse population. And then that leading researcher recently saw him present at a conference, and he presented on this fact that an individual with a brain injury is 11 times more likely to die of an accidental poisoning. 11 times more likely. Homelessness. 45% of homeless men found to have a history of TBI. This was in a New York study. 87% of them, it was prior to losing their home. And 70% of them sustained as a child or a teen. Suicide risk. A study found that even 7 years after an injury had a higher risk of suicide. So, giving you all that information, but now, obviously, this is a passion for me. One of the things is what is the North Dakota Brain Injury Network doing to help? And so some of the things that we're doing. The North Dakota Brain Injury Network, we are a resource available across the state. We do have a 1-800 number and a website with resources. We do provide on-site trainings. We also have online courses and education modules, specifically one course on pediatric brain injury. We do provide technical assistance and resources available. So we're able to come in and be available on site to provide technical assistance to help with the development of screening protocols, the development of IEPs, 504s, all of those things to really help schools with providing services for the individual's brain injury they work with within their programs. All of our services are free, and we're always welcome and available to help out as we can. So that's kind of why we're here and how we want to be helping shape that future. Because one of the things that I see is too often I run into people who it's 20 years later, and yes, they've known about that brain injury all along, but they've never really had an understanding of it. I feel that a lot of times when I talk to an adult that had a pediatric brain injury, they'll tell me that I'm the first person to ever really explain to them how their brain works after their injury in a way that they can understand and how they can apply that to their life. So thank you.